The cobbled streets of Victorian London glistened with rain under the dim glow of gas lamps. The air was thick with fog, muffling the sounds of the bustling city, now eerily quiet. Then came the scream. A constable patrolling Whitechapel froze as the sound pierced the still night. When he turned the corner, what he saw would haunt him forever. A lifeless body sprawled in a dark alley, the woman's throat slashed with precision, her lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. Nearby, a piece of paper bore the chilling words, "Catch me if you can." This was just the beginning. Over the next few months, more bodies would be found, each more horrifying than the last. Panic gripped the city. Who was this shadowy figure dubbed the London Ripper? And why did he choose to leave cryptic notes as if mocking the very men who hunted him? As the press sensationalized the killings, the public demanded answers, but every lead seemed to vanish into the fog. Was he a butcher, skilled with a blade? A doctor hiding in plain sight? Or something more sinister? A monster no one could imagine. Tonight, we dive into the heart of this chilling case, uncovering the clues, the suspects, and the questions that remain unanswered. Was the London Ripper ever within the grasp of justice? And with today's technology, could we finally unmask the shadow that terrorized a city? Stay with us as we unravel one of history's darkest mysteries. Victorian London in the late 19th century was a city of contrasts, an industrial powerhouse brimming with innovation and opportunity, yet plagued by poverty, crime, and despair. Its skyline was punctuated by smoking chimneys and grand cathedrals, but beneath the surface, in the shadowy alleys and overcrowded tenements, a darker reality brewed. The East End of London, where our story unfolds, was a stark reminder of the city's glaring inequalities. Whitechapel, in particular, was a labyrinth of narrow streets and grimy alleyways. The air reeked of coal smoke and waste, and the constant murmur of crowded pubs and street vendors created a chaotic backdrop for the lives of the working class. Here, survival was a daily struggle. Families were crammed into dilapidated rooms, and many women, unable to find steady work, turned to prostitution to make ends meet. The people of Whitechapel were no strangers to crime. Pickpocketing, drunken brawls, and petty theft were part of everyday life. However, even in a place accustomed to hardship, fear began to take hold. It wasn't just the murders, it was the horrifying brutality of them. These weren't random acts of violence. They seemed calculated, almost surgical. The people whispered of a figure stalking the streets at night, someone who knew the shadows better than the constables tasked with keeping order. At the time, the Metropolitan Police Force was still in its infancy, struggling to cope with the demands of a rapidly growing city. Their methods were rudimentary. Officers patrolled the streets on foot, armed with little more than whistles and truncheons. The concept of forensic science was non-existent. Bloodstains, fingerprints, and fibers, clues that could crack a case today, were simply overlooked or misunderstood. The press, meanwhile, fed on the fear. Newspapers sold sensationalized accounts of the killings, painting the unknown murderer as a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the light of the gas lamps. The term serial killer had yet to be coined, but the public knew they were dealing with something new, a predator who struck without warning, leaving a gruesome signature behind. Women, especially those working the streets, felt the terror most acutely. Many refused to go out after dark, and some carried rudimentary weapons for protection. Yet, in Whitechapel's tight-knit community, where poverty often forced difficult choices, even fear wasn't enough to keep everyone safe. The killer seemed to know this, exploiting the vulnerability of his victims, choosing his moments with chilling precision. London's fog, often romanticized in literature, added to the sense of dread. wasn't uncommon for the mist to grow so thick that people could scarcely see their own hands in front of them. For the killer, this was the perfect cover. For the residents, it was a smothering reminder of how invisible and powerless they felt. This wasn't just a crime spree. It was a psychological assault on the city. Each murder deepened the mystery, and the lack of answers only fed the hysteria. The streets buzzed with rumors. Was the killer a deranged local? A doctor using medical knowledge to mutilate his victims? Or was he someone completely unexpected? Someone who blended so seamlessly into the fabric of London that he became a ghost. In Victorian London, crime wasn't new, but the level of fear now gripping the city was unprecedented. Whitechapel became a stage for one of history's most chilling and enduring mysteries. A hunt for a predator who seemed to vanish as quickly as he struck, leaving only death and questions in his wake. This was the backdrop against which the London Ripper emerged. A city poised on the edge of terror. A foggy, crowded maze where danger seemed to lurk around every corner. The stage was set, and the shadows had come alive. It began with a discovery so grotesque, so unthinkable, that even seasoned constables struggled to hold their composure. On a cold August morning in 1888, the body of Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to those who frequented the East End, was found lying in a narrow Whitechapel street. Her throat had been savagely slit, and her abdomen bore deep, deliberate cuts. What struck investigators immediately was the precision of the wounds, as if the killer knew anatomy, knew how to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. Polly was not the first woman to be murdered in Whitechapel, but something about this killing felt different. The brutality was calculated, almost ritualistic, and when a second body was discovered just days later, any hope that this was an isolated event evaporated. On September 8, 1888, Annie Chapman was found in a yard behind 29 Hanbury Street. Her injuries were even more horrifying than Polly's. Her throat had been slashed with such force that it nearly decapitated her, and her abdomen had been mutilated, with organs removed and placed beside her body. This wasn't just murder, it was desecration. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man speaking with Annie shortly before her death, but their descriptions varied wildly, leaving the police with no solid leads. Panic spread like wildfire. The press labeled the killer Leather Apron, stoking rumors of a butcher or tradesman with a penchant for blood. Women of Whitechapel, especially those who worked the streets, began to fear the night. Some banded together, refusing to go out alone. Others carried knives, hoping to defend themselves against a phantom no one had seen clearly, but everyone felt closing in. The killer's confidence only grew. Less than a month later, on the night of September 30th, he struck twice in what became known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride was the first victim that night, found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been cut, but her body lacked the mutilations seen in the earlier murders. Many believe the killer may have been interrupted, forcing him to flee before completing his grim ritual. But the bloodlust wasn't sated. Just 45 minutes later, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. Her injuries were far more brutal. Her face was disfigured, her throat slit, and her abdomen savagely mutilated. Once again, the killer had removed organs, leaving investigators baffled by the speed and precision of his work. Near her body, the police found a clue: a piece of her bloody apron discarded nearby, alongside graffiti scrawled on a wall. The message read, "The U's are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Whether this cryptic note was left by the killer or merely a coincidence remains a topic of debate, but its discovery only deepened the mystery. By now, the public's terror had turned into outright hysteria. Crowds formed nightly, patrolling the streets with makeshift weapons, determined to catch the killer themselves. The police, overwhelmed and under-resourced, faced growing criticism for their inability to stop the murders. Letters began arriving at police stations, many claiming to be from the killer himself. One, signed Jack the Ripper, would forever etch the name into history. The final canonical victim was Mary Jane Kelly, murdered on November 9, 1888. Mary's death was the most savage of them all. Found in her small room on Miller's Court, her body was unrecognizable. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition. Her throat was slashed to the bone, and her entire body was eviscerated. The room was a blood-soaked scene of carnage, as if the killer had finally unleashed the full extent of his depravity. Unlike the previous murders, Mary was killed indoors, suggesting the killer had adapted his methods to ensure he wouldn't be interrupted. Each of these murders shared certain characteristics: the choice of vulnerable women, the gruesome mutilations, and the calculated removal of organs. Yet each killing escalated in ferocity, as if the Ripper were refining his craft, or his madness. The city was transfixed by his trail of blood, unable to comprehend the mind capable of such atrocities. But the killer's most chilling weapon wasn't his knife. It was his invisibility. Despite witnesses, clues, and relentless patrols, Jack the Ripper remained a ghost, always one step ahead. And as the fog rolled over Whitechapel, the people of London knew one horrifying truth: the monster could be anyone. The investigation into the London Ripper was unlike anything the Metropolitan Police had faced before. As the bodies piled up, the pressure to catch the killer intensified. But in an era before modern forensics, the tools available to investigators were woefully inadequate, and the killer seemed to revel in their frustration. The first major clue came after the murder of Catherine Eddowes. Near her mutilated body, police found a bloodied piece of her apron discarded in Goulston Street. Above it, scrawled in chalk on a wall, was the cryptic message, "The yous are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was this a taunt from the Ripper, or merely an unrelated scribble? The message was erased almost immediately. Out of fear, it might incite anti-Semitic riots in the area, leaving investigators to rely only on the apron fragment for evidence. The taunts continued. A series of letters, claiming to be from the killer, flooded police stations and newspaper offices. Most were dismissed as hoaxes, but one stood out: the infamous Dear Boss letter. Written in red ink, it promised more murders and was signed Jack the Ripper, a name that stuck. Shortly after, another letter arrived containing half of a preserved human kidney, believed by some to belong to Catherine Eddowes. While these letters captured public attention, their authenticity remains debated. The police zeroed in on suspects, but none seemed to fit completely. John Pizer, a Polish immigrant and leather worker, was an early suspect due to rumors linking him to the nickname Leather Apron. Despite public suspicion, he was quickly cleared of involvement. Another suspect, Montague Druitt, a barrister who drowned himself in the Thames shortly after the murders ended, fit the profile of someone who might have disappeared due to guilt. Yet no concrete evidence tied him to the crimes. The investigation wasn't just a battle of wits. It became a political nightmare. The press criticized Scotland Yard relentlessly, accusing them of incompetence. Public outrage mounted as each new murder further highlighted the force's inability to protect Whitechapel's vulnerable women. The police ramped up patrols, enlisted undercover officers, and even consulted psychics in a desperate bid for leads. Despite their efforts, every promising lead turned cold. Witness accounts were contradictory at best. Some described the killer as a well-dressed gentleman. Others swore he was a disheveled laborer. The lack of forensic science left investigators fumbling in the dark, relying on intuition and circumstantial evidence. the Ripper's cunning was unmatched. He seemed to strike without pattern or warning, vanishing into the fog before anyone could react. For every clue uncovered, 2 more questions emerged, leaving the police chasing shadows. By the time the murders abruptly stopped, Scotland Yard was left with only theories, dead suspects, and an enduring mystery. Even as the investigation faded from active pursuit, one thing was clear. The Ripper had not only outwitted the police, but also ensured his legend would endure, haunting the streets of Whitechapel forever. Over the decades, countless theories have been proposed about the identity of Jack the Ripper. Was he a deranged local, a skilled professional, or someone hiding in plain sight? The lack of solid evidence left the case open to endless speculation, with each theory as chilling as the crimes themselves. One of the earliest suspects was Montague Druitt, a barrister whose death in the Thames coincided with the end of the murders. Some believe Druitt's apparent suicide was fueled by guilt, though no concrete evidence tied him to the killings. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who lived near the murder sites and was committed to an asylum shortly after the Ripper's spree. In recent years, DNA evidence from a shawl allegedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes seemed to implicate Kosminski, but the findings have been hotly debated for their lack of reliability and contamination concerns. Other suspects include Walter Sickert, a prominent artist whose macabre paintings and alleged obsession with the case have fueled speculation, and even royal figures like Prince Albert Victor, whose connections to the East End sparked conspiracy theories. Yet, for every suspect, there are critical holes in the evidence, leaving no definitive answers. Modern criminology offers new insights. Many psychological profiles suggest the Ripper was a classic, organized serial killer, someone intelligent, methodical, and possibly living a double life. His gruesome mutilations indicate not just rage, but a dark fascination with anatomy, leading some to believe he may have been a surgeon or butcher. Could modern technology finally unmask him? Advances in DNA testing and genealogical research have reopened cold cases before, sparking hope that the Ripper's identity might one day be uncovered. Yet the passage of time has left much of the evidence degraded or lost entirely, making a breakthrough increasingly unlikely. What makes the London Ripper so enduring isn't just the mystery of who he was, but why he killed. Was he driven by madness, revenge, or a warped sense of purpose? As modern science advances, we may edge closer to answers, but the shadows of Victorian London continue to guard their secrets. The case of the London Ripper remains one of history's most chilling enigmas. Over a century later, the shadow of this unknown predator still looms large over the streets of Whitechapel, a haunting reminder of how fear can grip an entire city. The Ripper wasn't just a killer, he was a phantom, an unseen force that defied capture and left behind a legacy of terror. His crimes revealed the vulnerabilities of Victorian London, a city struggling with inequality, overcrowding, and the limits of its fledgling police force. Each murder exposed societal fractures, sparking debates about class, gender, and the treatment of marginalized communities. And yet, the Ripper's greatest impact might lie not in the murders themselves, but in the obsession they sparked. A fascination with the macabre that still captivates us today. Why does the story of the London Ripper endure? Perhaps it's the fear of the unknown, the idea that someone so brutal could walk among us undetected. Or perhaps it's the frustration of an unfinished puzzle, a mystery tantalizingly close yet forever out of reach. Theories abound, but the truth remains elusive, locked away in the foggy alleys of history. As we close the chapter on this dark tale, one question lingers. Was the Ripper a criminal genius who manipulated the chaos of his time, or was he simply a man whose monstrous deeds were shielded by the limitations of the era? Maybe, with advances in technology, we'll one day find the answer. Until then, the London Ripper's story remains a chilling testament to the depths of human darkness and the enduring allure of an unsolved mystery. Thank you for joining us in exploring one of history's darkest legends. Let us know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true crime stories. Who knows? Maybe the next mystery we uncover will finally give us the answers we've been seeking.